Go!
Welcome to Graph 101 from Intune.training, where your hosts Jóhannes and Sean pretend to know what Jake is doing.
I don't really know what I'm doing either, so as per usual.
As per usual. And this is not the second take of this.
No.
I promise.
Third or the
Absolutely
fourth?
not.
No, it's the first. Yeah, for sure.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, wink, wink. So what are we talking about, Sean?
That's a great question. We wanted to know what you're talking about. Something
I think we're going to talk about Azure Functions and how to get that all set up in VS Code and start coding away. So we're not like doing everything locally anymore, or locally in a sense, if that makes any sense.
So,
sense.
Pop quiz, because we didn't cover this before. What is an Azure function?
You're probably want to, what is an Azure function? Why would we want to use it? So traditionally, the way that we've been doing all of our like testing and everything, we just open up VS Code. We're like locally signing in using our, we use an Azure function, but we're signing in with our user account to authenticate with it. And that's not great, especially if you want to do things like good old scheduled tasks, or you want something to happen like at a set period of time. You want to just call something and have it run without needing to worry about the authentication piece every single time. Automation at the end of the day.
If we were to tie in what the intern said last week to today, this is essentially what part of that automation thing. So when that Azure function uses that managed service account, how it's all going to run in the cloud.
Exactly.
Jake sitting there and using device login in the browser every single
Correct. And I'm not going to pretend to be nearly as smart as Ben is in that previous episode, but will be utilizing MSI auth and all that fun stuff. And we'll take a little look at it
with dashing good looks.
Right. And we'll take a little bit of a look at that. But for right now, at least we're going to at least get like VS Code and everything else set up so we can start doing this moving forward. So without further ado, we'll swap over to our machine here. Now I've got pretty much a fresh Azure VM here. And just to show you, what we have installed so far, we've got Docker Desktop, Git. I did install PowerShell 7, and then we've got VS Code as well. Now, as far as like, what did we do for these installations? Well, Jake went out and downloaded them and spammed through all the next buttons. There were no extra, I didn't do any customization or anything crazy as far as the different, like selecting different options. I just did all the defaults for all the installations. You might already have some of this already pre-configured on your machine, which is great. In this case, we're, starting fresh for those that may not have some of the things. But we'll kind of walk through things here. So I've got Docker running in the background. You'll see you got good old green screen, which means the engine's running. We'll need that a little bit later. But in VS Code, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over to extension.
Wait a second.
Yes, Sean.
I thought we were talking about Azure Functions, which run, in Azure.
We are talking about Azure Functions.
But we're back in VS Code. Why?
Because that's where we're going to do all the edits. I don't know about you, but I don't feel like editing everything directly inside of Azure, where it's almost like you're typing in a notepad file. So I'm losing out on things like IntelliSense, all the like beautiful color coding and coordination that PowerShell has to offer, all of that fun stuff.
Oh, okay.
That kind of makes sense, and we can look at that a little bit later too in the portal, or we'll be able to see that at least. Okay. But for now, we're going to do all in VS Code because that's what most of us, I think, are used to. So for the extension, I'm going to just search for Azure Function to start. We're going to go ahead and install that. I'm also going to grab dev containers, which is, look, it's in the recommended section. I'm going to go ahead and install that as well. Awesome. And we're going to do good old Control-Shift-P. Bring up the command palette. And look, Azure Functions. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's already starting to show up for us. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a function app in Azure. Now, it's going to ask us... Oh, go ahead, Jóhannes. What was that?
No way.
Yes, we're going to do it directly from VS Code. Now, it's going to ask me to sign into Azure, which I'm going to do. So we'll have to type in all my fancy information.
That was pretty fancy.
Very fast. Oh, look at that. I totally have multi-factor and everything set up. sarcasm. But we're going to select our subscription, which is going to be, there's only the one subscription in our Azure tenant. And now it wants me to create a name. Let's stick with a theme here. Ben is a wiggle. I think, oh, look, it's not unique. Someone already used it. It might have been me in testing. We'll do Ben as a wiggle for sure.
Oh, that works.
That seems pretty unique. And we've got some other options. So like, what runtime stack do we want? I don't know about you guys, but I am not a .NET or a Python or Node.js whiz, not even a Java whiz. But PowerShell, I know a little bit of PowerShell. Wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I know a bit. So I'm going to select that. For my location, this is personal preference for the most part. I'm a big fan of East US and East US 2. I used to be a massive fan of Central US, but lately it seems like they've been having some issues with resource allocation. So
I'm partial to Europe myself.
What was that, Jóhannes?
I'm partial to Europe myself.
Oh, why? Does that have anything to do with your location?
No, it's the free healthcare.
Oh, okay, I got you. But so we signed in there, and you'll notice, hey, Azure Jake at Intune Training shows up at the bottom here. And I also see Azure off to the side here. If I pop open this, what's this on the side? We have function apps. And I bet if we open this, we're going to see a whole bunch of different ones. Oh, we definitely do. But we also see down here in the Azure activity log that it's actually creating a function app for us. So Ben is a wiggle for sure is getting created, but it's not here yet. So we'll wait for this to finish, and then we'll refresh things. You'll come to learn that when you're working in Azure or Intune or anything else, it's a waiting game. Anyone happen to have that XKDC offhand?
XKCD?
Yeah, where it's like, what are you doing? We're waiting for our program to compile. Okay. There we go. So now we see, hey, Ben is a wiggle for sure, and it shows up there. It's like, okay, cool. We've got that now. What else, do we do from there? Like if I open this up, I see, oh, functions. That's kind of like what we want to make, right? Like we want functions. Well, there's nothing in there right now. So what we can do is we'll do Control-Shift-P again to bring up that command palette. And we did create function app already in Azure, but there's also create function. So I'm going to actually create a function. And it's going to ask us to select a folder, like where we want to actually store this information for right now. And for right now, I'm just going to go on the desktop, and I'm going to create like a new folder, good old Windows waiting for it to bring up the new folder log. So Ben is a wiggle for sure. A naming convention, personal preference. But I'm going to select that. And we're going to go ahead and do a PowerShell project. And you've got a couple different options here as far as what function or trigger you want to use for this particular function that we're making to actually launch or do the thing. And the two that you'll most likely use the most are at the top, and that's an HTTP trigger or a timer trigger, which is basically a cron job. So if you want stuff to happen at a specific time on specific days, of the week, timer trigger is the way to go. If you want to trigger something via like an HTTP call, it's almost like a pseudo API that you're creating yourself, you can do an HTTP trigger. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and do an HTTP trigger just so we can see what that looks like, because luckily they kind of provide some guidance or a generic script for us so we can see what that looks like. It's going to give us a default name. I'm going to change this to Ben is a wiggle HTTP because I know it's an HTTP call. And for the authorization level, I'm just going to leave it at the default of function. And then we have some other options here. So we can open it in this current window, or we can open it in a new window. And what it's basically asking is, do you want to open it in this current Visual Studio Code window or a brand new one entirely? In this case, I'm going to just go ahead and do open a new window. So we'll give that a second, and it's going to pop open a new one for us. Boom. And yes, I do trust all of the authors because I am the author. Maybe I should have said no to that because I don't trust myself sometimes. But it's not super important right now. You'll notice over in Explorer that we have some additional things here. We got like profile requirements. I see like, hey, there's that bed. There's a wiggle HTTP. We've got a function, this PowerShell script and things like that. At this point, I could technically edit everything here and throw it up into Azure if I wanted to. But I'm going to go the extra mile, and I actually want to set up containerization with Docker as well, so that I can actually kind of like emulate what this would look like on the Azure side of things to make sure it would all functions as I'd expect it to.
Is there a reason you want that? Is it faster? Is it more reliable?
Yeah, and again, you're basically going to make sure that whatever you're coding like runs in a container and works just as it would when it's running inside of the Azure side of things. So we're still technically running it all locally, but that we're testing it that way.
So is an Azure function basically a container then?
It is, yes. And it's all, at least by default, it's set up to be consumptionless, so very, very inexpensive. There are other options as far as like payment model go if you want to have things like always on demand, always running. But for what we're doing realistically, consumption is the way to go. But I want to make sure that I, copy this over to like a GitHub repository. So in source control, I'm going to go ahead and commit this right away. We'll say yes. And I don't have GitHub set up yet. So when I do like first commit, I hit the checkbox. It's probably going to want me to sign in. Yeah, we'll save here. And we're going to publish that branch. Oh, yeah, of course, because I'm not signed into GitHub yet. Let's do that. Oh, at least Jake has multi-factor authentication set up on GitHub, right?
Hey, that's the code I'll use on my luggage.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Wait, where are you getting this fifth one from?
Yeah.
But you'll notice when I went to publish that branch, it's given me the option if I want to publish in a private or a public repository. In this use case, I'm going to go with just a public. It's not like there's nothing that I'm going to be putting in there that like anyone else can't really see or I'm concerned with. So we'll do public for now. And again, we play the waiting game. Anyone got any good jokes? Aside from me, don't point your fingers at me.
Why is a pregnant horse faster than a regular horse?
I am going to question if this is appropriate or not.
It has 2 horsepower.
That makes total sense.
Where was your mind going?
Yeah.
No comment, Sean.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to excuse Jake.
Right. As we continue to wait for this publishing. It could also totally be VS Code just being incredibly slow. Let's go here. Oops. Not that. Your repositories.
Who's that guy?
For sure. Oh, nothing yet. I can make sure this goes a little bit faster, right? There was a sign in button hidden behind, but that's okay. We can just start all over here. Woo! Succeeded.
They could have made that more obvious, I think.
They really could have. Boom. All right. So we see some stuff in here now, which is great. Again, Jake missed the sign-in option. Not a surprise to miss something. But now that all that is in GitHub, we now have like source control, essentially. But, it doesn't just stop there because we put it there. But now we need to get the container piece going. And one of the things we installed earlier in the extensions was that dev containers section. Or extension. So if I do Control-Shift-P again, We've got dev containers. And there's a couple different things that we see here. The one that we're worried about is clone repository in container volume. So we're going to click that. And it's going to say, hey, by the way, you're cloning a repository in a dev container may execute arbitrary code because we're running code in a container locally on that particular device. It's like, well, cool. It seems pretty obvious, but good to know. So we say, got it there. And once again, kind of waiting for there we go, the little pop up there. So we're going to clone a repository from GitHub, and we're going to throw it into a container volume. And we're going to grab that Ben is a wiggle for sure that we just created. Luckily, it throws the most recent up at the top for us. And we're going to select master. And this, the first time you do this, is going to be a massive waiting game. And you can click on the starting dev container show log button to actually follow along with the container being built. And eventually, we'll be able to actually see the container show up inside of Docker as well.
So should we use this episode as the first episode in our next series, Waiting 101?
That might be in a more advanced course, Sean.
Oh, I can see it's downloading a bunch of stuff.
Yes, it's downloading basically all the prerequisites and requirements in order for that container to function. So like I said, the first time you do this, it's going to be relatively slow. But assuming you're working off of the same box in the future and things like that, it'll be relatively pretty snappy. If you were to go to a brand new box and do the same thing, again, you're going to play the waiting game. And you'll see once we actually get in there that you can add more things to it to make it take even longer. So different things your different PowerShell modules and things like that. If you're interacting with anything in Azure or doing something with another API, you might need other PowerShell modules. Not everything's going to be an invoke REST method, or not necessarily, at least.
So I'm guessing if you are using some of the graph modules, you want to be very careful with which module do you load. You don't want to load the entire graph.
Or even just the AZ module, right? Because AZ, for Azure, has so many different extra little things. I can't remember the exact size of just all of AZ, but it's pretty large. You want bits and pieces of it.
Yeah.
One thing that we'll kind of look at a little bit later too, one of my favorite things to utilize, at least from the Azure side, is key vaults. Because even though this is all running in the cloud in a container, I don't have to ever see it, I still don't want to hard code any credential that I might need or some secret key that needs to be utilized to access some resource or something along those lines. So we'll look at doing key vault stuff a little bit later in another episode too, and how to pull in that information and how to give that enterprise app, which we'll see, access. And actually, that's a great thing to pull up while we wait. So let's actually go into the Azure portal. There's that resource group. It automatically created one for us. So Ben is a wiggle for sure. And there's a couple different things that we're going to see in this resource group right off the bat. The first is the app service plan. You got your function app down here, which is where you're going to spend most of your time if you're actually in the portal here. You've got your application insights. This is something that when you manually configure or go in the advanced options, you can turn off if you'd like. I like having it on because it gives you some additional logging information if you're trying to diagnose something going wrong. So always nice to have that on, and it's going to create a storage account for you by default as well. I do utilize that in a couple of projects myself for some other, table storage and things like that. But in the actual function app itself, there's a whole bunch of different things down here, and we're not going to explore every single one. But one of the big components that Ben was talking about previously is that identity section. And you'll have system assigned and user assigned as an option. System assigned is the one that we want, and I'm going to turn that on for right now. And it's it'll be registered in Azure Active Directory. It's going to basically show up in that enterprise applications list. So we'll say yes to that. And we'll give it a few seconds here. And boom, we now have an object principal ID. So technically, if we were to copy that ID, head over into Azure again, load up good old Azure Active Directory, and go over to Enterprise Applications and search for it. Oh, look.
Look at that.
Sure shows up. Now, I believe Ben talked about it in the previous episode, but you'll notice there's that Azure role assignment section, which is kind of like, an app registration where you could give it like its permissions and things like that. But you can't actually give it the permissions properly. You'll see like it's in preview right now. It doesn't actually work, but you can do it via a PowerShell script, which we'll probably take a look at in another episode as well. We're not really worried about giving this any like crazy access right now. We're just getting things set up for the future. So we won't worry about that right now, at least. But additionally, in the function app itself, you'll see there's this functions section. And right now, there's nothing here. And you're probably wondering, well, hey, we were over in VS Code and you made that HTTP trigger and things like that. It's like, yes, I made it locally. It has not been published up into Azure yet. So we'll get to that in a second once the container is actually finished and created for us. And you'll also notice that our app is in read-only mode since we're running it from a package file. So essentially from VS Code. Popping back over to VS Code, we're still in that waiting game.
This really does take a minute.
It does.
Can we open up that dev container blog, or is that already open?
Oh, in Docker?
In VS Code, you can see it on the bottom right. Starting dev container show a log.
That log is.
That is this
right
one.
Here,
Okay.
In the terminal. Yep. Yeah, give feedback. Make things run faster.
You're not running this on some potato VM, are you?
No, I'm not. This is actually a pretty solid one.
1 core, 2 gigs of RAM.
No, so actually, this brings up a very important thing. You're probably earlier I mentioned that I'm running this in an Azure VM. In order for that to work, I need nested virtualization to work, and you need a beefier VM for nested virtualization. And you're probably wondering, well, what does that mean, like on my local machine? On your local machine, if you're doing this, if you can run Hyper-V, like you turn Hyper-V on, you're good to go. You basically just need to be able to run virtualization containers, so Docker. Since I'm running this in a VM, in order to do a VM inside of a VM inception, you need that nested virtualization, which again, a little bit more beefier of a machine. Now, granted, I think this is a 4-core 8 gig, if I'm not mistaken, 16 gig, but that particular SKU supports nested virtualization. Typical Jake, way more information is actually needed. But hey, we're only on step 4 out of 9.
Yeah.
We're getting there. So we'll probably cut.
Step 4 out of 9.
Yeah, we should just cut this.
We'll cut and wait. And we'll be back.
Wham bam.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hey, look at that.
Oh, we're not done yet.
This reminds me of when I was installing Gentoo back in the day. I want those months of my life back.
This reminds me of, if any of you ever played, what game was it? Guild Wars.
Oh, fuck, dude. My Guild Wars 2 playtime is embarrassing.
And the game that I had embarrassing playtime on was Warhammer Online. I forget how much time I had, like literally full-time job hours in the game in a year.
Damn.
100 some hours or 100 some days of playtime. Yeah, it was embarrassing.
Okay, ready to go back?
All right, and with some Hollywood magic, bam, we're back.
Poof. So we saw that our log window is gone. Terminal has stopped and is no longer downloading things, which is a plus. You'll notice on the left-hand side, we've got the same, similar stuff to what we saw earlier in our just our folder, but we've got like this extra dev container folder. And look at that. We've got some more stuff going on down here, but that's not important right now. But we see like we've got this dev container folder, this npm ignore file that got created. But if we open up like this dev container JSON file, we can see some interesting things. Like, oh, there's that Azure Functions and PowerShell that we had selected. The default, terminal, like that we're selecting is PowerShell and different things like that, and some extensions. And so, yes, if you wanted to add extra extensions in this quote unquote container when you're working, you can add them here and it'll automatically import them for you. That's a whole other thing to dive into as well. In the Docker file, we can actually see like, what version of PowerShell we're running. Arg variant equals 7. But, again, we're not going to worry about messing with any of this right now. In the Ben is a wiggle HTTP function that we had created, that's where kind of the most of the magic is. And it's the run.ps1 is what gets created or generated for us. There's some other things in here like the function JSON that just like tells us like, yeah, it's an HTTP trigger. It's a function. You've got your get and post methods, some really basic stuff. But in run.ps1, it's going to give us this example template, essentially. First of all, if you call or try to run it, it's going to say, hey, your thing triggered successfully. But it's also checking to see, like, do you want to pass in like a name? And if you do, if name exists, essentially, we'll change the body to say hello name, instead of hello world. So somewhat of an upgrade from hello world for your first application. Otherwise, if you just call this HTTP function later on, which we'll do in a little bit here, you're going to just simply get, hey, this HTTP trigger function executed successfully. It's like, yay, success. But so it's going to create all that for us. We're not going to dive into like changing this really too much right now because, again, we just wanted to get things set up, at least for now. And let's kind of like look at what else we've got in here. So some other important ones is like this profile.ps1. This right here, this is what actually does that authentication piece on the Azure side of things. So when the container gets created, spun up inside of the Azure side of things, this is what gets utilized to sign in or authenticate with that MSI secret. So that enterprise application that we created with that system signed variable. So you're never going to have to go into your, run.ps1 for that particular function and be like, I'm going to authenticate and things like that, because it's all done already for you via this profile. The requirements one, this is a super interesting one to take a look at because this is where you can specify all the modules that you want to actually have installed when this gets created. So you'll notice like you have your param block here with and everything's kind of commented out. But if there were specific modules that you needed to utilize from PowerShell, you can just simply add them here. And when the instance or container gets created, it's going to download those for you. So you don't have to worry about, doing good old install module and all that fun nonsense. Does it for you. But I'm going to head over to source control and we're going to go ahead and commit all of our changes here just so that we have it all saved up inside of GitHub. We'll do second commit. Yeah, we'll save. And we'll sync. Sure, we'll periodically check for those. Beautiful. So now if I were to like go into GitHub, give this a refresh, we're going to see some extra things. Oh, look, dev containers there now. But all the stuff that we are working on is now there as well. Now, again, we don't see that on the actual function side of things, though. Like it's just in GitHub right now. So we actually need to push this into Azure. So if we head back over to VS Code, Control-Shift-P, and Azure Functions, and it's been a second. Jake needs to scroll through the list and find the right one. Azure Functions deploy to function app is what we want to select. So we're going to select that. And we're going to deploy to Ben as a wiggle for sure. Make sure you select the right one. You'll notice it didn't necessarily do whatever one was the most recent there. And it's going to give you a warning, first of all, like, hey, are you sure you want to deploy to this? Because it's going to overwrite anything that's already there. So if you like went and made something manual or anything like that, it's going to overwrite it essentially.
I noticed it didn't ask you if you trust yourself here.
Yes, exactly. This is the do you trust yourself? Most of the time, no. But I'm going to hit deploy. What's the worst that could happen, right? And that's going to give you a nice output window as well. We'll close all these messages out. They're not super important right now. And we'll wait for that to actually finish its deployment.
Sure, there's a lot of waiting on this video, Jake.
It really is. What do you mean? There's none. It's all going to be edited out, Jóhannes.
Yeah, with Hollywood magic.
Exactly. Who doesn't love a 2-hour Intune training video?
Yeah. Isn't that what they're supposed to be?
All right. So you'll notice it says deployment successful, but we're going to give it a few seconds here because it's still technically loading there because it's going to start syncing the triggers, as you can see.
Oh, so it was successful, but not really.
Basically, it's like spinning up the actual function side of things. Cool. So now, if we head back over here and hit refresh, oh, look at that.
Ooh.
We now have a function in here. Ben is a wiggle. And if we go to code and test, it's going to, we'll give it a second to load.
More waiting, more loading.
Right? But, hey, look, we can see all of our code here. And this is where I was getting into, like, you can totally edit everything here. It's in read-only mode since we are doing it from like GitHub and VS Code. But if you were to manually come into the Azure portal and create this function app, you could totally do it all directly from the portal. But that is not fun to do. But I'm going to hit test and run here. And I'm going to actually get function URL is what I want. I'm going to copy this URL. And I'm going to open up just PowerShell. We're going to do invoke REST method. Ooh, and we probably can totally change this to file system logs because it's going to give us some cool things. Okay. Didn't click file system logs fast enough, but we'll run it again here in a second. But you'll see, hey, this HTTP trigger function executed successfully. Pass a name in the query string, blah, blah, blah. Which is exactly what our body said to send back if there like is no name present, essentially. So we almost, in a sense, like created our own like little pseudo API. There.
Is this the first time on Intune training where something worked on first try?
Define first try.
That's a very niche term.
Yeah, define first try is the key word there. But I'll try running this again and we should see, there we go. In the file system logs, we've got like some extra things like, hey, we executed this function, at this specific time. And hey, it processed a request, which is what we told in the right host by default here. So things are working, which means we have everything set up to start creating some magic as far as, what all we can do with this. Like, do some crazy group creation, do some crazy automation on the Intune side of things. I think we plan on getting some feedback from the rest of the community on like what we should build. We're not gonna go too crazy, I think, on what's available, but we'll definitely try to hammer out some of the community asks as they come in. I think I could be wrong. What do you guys think? Does that sound
like a good idea?
I mean, if you think about it, what problems are you solving on a Windows server today with a scheduled task that, hey, maybe you want to do that as an Azure function instead?
Yeah, there's plenty of those, that's for sure. And I'm sure you're probably hard coding some credentials on that server when you were doing it that way too. So we can get rid of that. But at least for right now, I think that's going to wrap up this episode as far as getting things all set up. But with that, I'll drop some links in the comments to like the downloads as far as like getting PowerShell 7, Git, Docker, all that fun nonsense set up. But other than that, thanks for watching and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.